We've had some interesting guest callers before, but I'm pretty sure this is the first one who's been involved in a bank robbery. Hello, and welcome to the 23rd installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at the 23rd episode of Frasier, entitled Frasier Crane's Day Off. This episode's title is an obvious reference to the classic 1986 John Hughes comedy Ferris Bueller's Day Off. As a real quick aside before we get into this episode, I've seen most of Hughes' 80s classic comedies and enjoyed all of them to some varying degree. The generally accepted critical reception is that either The Breakfast Club or Ferris Bueller's Day Off is his best film. I tend to disagree with this assessment, although I think both of those films are quite good. For me, 16 Candles is my favorite of the John Hughes classics, and easily Molly Ringwald's best film. Anyway, Frasier Crane's Day Off originally aired on May 12th, 1994, and attracted a poor 22.3 million viewers. This is a drop of almost 4 million from the previous week. Seinfeld also saw a heavy decline, but not quite as sharp, but still down over 3 million from the last episode. Shows don't usually drop this badly during the penultimate episode of a season, so I'm not sure what happened here. The only historical event of semi-related significance I could track down is this is the day the Tarantino classic Pulp Fiction premiered, which I somehow doubt is what led to the lower ratings this week. Frasier Crane's Day Off is another James Burrows directed episode, and the 6th episode to be written by my favorite writing team of Randberg and Flett. We're on production code 122 this week. In production order, Travels with Martin would have taken place between this episode and the finale next week. Our episode starts out with the Nothing Happening intro appearing for the 5th time here, tying it up as the least common intro along with the lights all over the city. We start out our episode with a guest caller scene, who Frasier accidentally made wreck thanks to his advice. This is the first episode since the Christmas episode to have more than 3 guest callers, and comes in at a record-crushing 7 callers. Our opening scene only features 1, and that it's a particularly single funny line from Steve Young. Young is a pretty interesting guest caller, and a first for the show. He's shown up on a number of different comedies, half the time as himself, in fact, with the exception of a background part in what sure sounds like an adult film. This is his first role where he isn't playing himself. He'll go on to appear in Beverly Hills 90210, Wings, and Lewis and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. While his minor acting career is interesting, Young is actually best known as a football player. He played 2 seasons for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and 13 for the San Francisco 49ers, during which time he was involved in winning 3 Super Bowls and won 2 MVP awards. This is the first football star we've had on the show, and a nice addition to our guest caller stable. As Frasier wraps up his radio program, we meet Gil Chesterton for the first time. We've heard reference to him before, but haven't actually seen him on the air. In an interesting bit of, irony, Gil mentions Bonnie Weems, who we met during the Christmas episode, but who doesn't show up again here. Gil is the radio station's food critic, and seems to be on after Frasier today, instead of Bulldog. He is played by Edward Hibbert. He's a "that guy who was in that thing" actor, and will appear as this character another 28 times on the show, beating Patrick Kersnell by 7 episodes. Hibbert has been in a ton of things since he started acting in 1977, including Murder, She Wrote, The 5 Mrs. Buchanans, The Nanny, Married with Children, Carolyn in the City, 15 episodes of Earthworm Jim, where he voiced the evil cat, All My Children, Law and Order, Caught in Cleveland, and my all-time favorite Christopher Nolan movie, The Prestige. He's also done his fair share of Broadway productions, including the David Hyde Pierce directed It Should Have Been You, and Curtains. He's also a literary agent for the now defunct Donato and Olsen Inc. The scene ends with Roz and Frasier discussing whether Gil is trying to steal their time slot or not, while Roz enjoys a rum-soaked ladyfinger. Since we have a food critic this episode, I thought it was interesting to note that a tiramisu, which I'd heard of plenty of times but never had, is the same thing, layered with custard and whipped topping. We open our next scene with a funny bit of dialogue from Martin, talking about how it's moving into spring weather. It's a great line that would only come from a sitcom cop, and shows why I've been such a fan of Ramberg and Fletch scripts. This very short scene ends with a sick Frasier coming into the room, and after attempting to leave for work, realizing he's too sick for work, and deciding to call in sick. Although, unlike Bueller, he's actually sick. We cut to Gil in Frasier's broadcasting booth, talking to his guest caller, who is a man named Louis, played by Gary Trudeau. Like our earlier guest caller, Trudeau is not an actor. In fact, this is his only credited acting role. Even more interestingly, at this point in time, he wasn't even really known as a television creator. He wrote and produced a political comedy miniseries, Tanner 88, before this, and would do another political comedy in 2013 called Alpha House. But with a few small exceptions, he's stayed away from writing television and movies. What he hasn't stayed away from is writing comic strips. Trudeau is the artist and creator of the Pulitzer Prize-winning comic strip Doonesbury, which he actually began under the name Bull Tales in the Yale newspaper, before being brought into the professional papers. Trudeau has been involved in a number of interesting controversies over the years, thanks to the subject matter of some of his strips, which has led to a number of strips being dropped from papers for a day or two. This included very adult comments on the Monica Lewinsky scandal during the Clinton presidency, the first depiction of premarital living together in a syndicated comic strip, and one that involved the praise of self-dating. There's a lot more that could be discussed about Trudeau, as he's a rather fascinating figure, but I think we've covered enough ground for the time being. For those wondering, the dessert Gil recommends to Trudeau is a Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, which is a Black Forest German cake. We see that while Gil is on the air, he's got his own producer, not Roz, working in the booth. I was a little surprised by this, but I guess it's a totally guest show, so it makes a certain amount of sense. Her identity is a bit of a mystery, and one I wasn't able to crack. She isn't credited, and doesn't have any lines. One Reddit user suggested she may be one of Martin's cop friends, who appears in a future episode. Unfortunately, the user didn't say which episode that comes from, so I can't verify this theory. We transition back to the sick Frasier, and for the first time, we get a good look at his bedroom. If there weren't so many guest stars going on this week, I'd take a more in-depth look at some of what's going on in here, but alas, we'll just have to save it for another time. The one thing I do want to call out from the background, really quickly, is Frasier has a few Rorschach prints in the background. I think this is a really funny gag, and one I very much appreciated. Niles shows up to visit his ailing brother, and is a total germaphobe, as usual. What started as essentially a background gag has now transformed into a complete character aspect for Niles, and is a very nice progression for his character. Niles mentions his maid Marta again. This isn't the first time we've heard mention of her, and it's a nice bit of continuity, which makes me wonder if we'll possibly meet her at some point in the future. And guess what? Niles didn't show up just to see how Frasier is doing. He also came to bring him a poultice from a remote city in Guatemala. It apparently smells quite bad. Poultices are sometimes known as cataplasms and are quite old, having no clear creation date in history. I've actually personally used them before without realizing it. The ones I've used haven't been filled with whatever the strange smelling one is Frasier gets, but filled with either rice or flaxseed to maintain warmth. The use of one with weird or foul-smelling herbs is a nice reminder of Maris's taste, which goes along quite well with her lamb placenta lotion from the other week. The somewhat loopy Frasier gets a call from Roz, who, after a whole season, Niles is still unclear on who she is. I'm guessing, after the time they spend together this week, we won't have this joke anymore. But who knows? Niles is pretty self-centered, so I could see him still forgetting who she is. This ultimately leads to Niles taking over the broadcasting while Frasier is off. We get some fun interactions with him and Roz. We get to see Niles trying out a bunch of different catchphrases, as apparently Frasier's "I'm listening" isn't good enough, and we get to see a few guest callers for Niles. They are Eddie Gourmet and Steve Lawrence, playing a couple who hasn't said "I love you" yet. This pair is actually a real-life couple and was married in 1957. The pair is primarily known for their music. Gourmet has released dozens of albums, both solo and with her husband, and throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s had a number of hits. Lawrence did his fair share of solo album work as well, but he also dedicated a lot of time to acting. He's appeared in a lot of television shows and movies, including both The Blues Brothers and The Blues Brothers 2000, Sanford and Son, Murder, She Wrote, Bob, The Nanny, where his wife also appeared, Hot in Cleveland, and 2.5 Men. Both Lawrence and Gourmet decided to retire in 2009. At first, Frasier is thrilled that Niles is doing a boring job on the radio. Niles mentions that Frasier is a Freudian, while he is a Jungian. Then later he mentions Sigmund Broman. A real quick psychology break here. Freud is extremely famous, and I'm sure everyone here has heard the term Freudian slip. From my perspective, as a psychological layman, I don't believe Jung is as famous. He took a hard split from Freud, and the two had some heated debate. From my very simplistic understanding here, Freud's theories centered heavily on the subconscious and its effects on the human mind, while Jung took an analytical perspective and grouped human minds into archetypes and self-identities. As far as I'm aware, unlike Freud and Jung, Sigmar Bromra is not a real psychiatrist, and no one with that name ever existed, except for a Warhammer character. I find this kind of an odd choice, given we've mostly used real doctors' names in the past on the show when having a psychological conversation. In any event, by the end of the episode, Niles has really found his footing in the radio world, and is basically a televangelist to his callers. It's really funny and a lot of fun. At this point, barring a Midwinter Night's Dream, this is my favorite Niles episode thus far in the series. One big difference in this episode from any we've had before is the inclusion of some dream sequences. I don't usually like dream episodes. Granted, this isn't a whole dream episode, just a few drug-induced dream sequences, but I still have mixed feelings about their use. It's pretty clear from the start a dream is what's going on here, as the ridiculous scene of Niles and Gil standing together and waving at the window wouldn't make any sense in reality. And the ending with Frasier exploding is obviously a dream. I do like the explosion shot, and if we slow it down, we can see Frasier, or a body double, just shoots straight up into the air when it happens. This leads to a sick and whining Frasier lashing out at Daphne, while he begs her to get medicine. I think it worth pointing out the medicine he asks her to get is Cyducane, which is an obvious reference to the writer Cy Duquesne. A very drugged up Frasier arrives at the radio station, and we have a new change to the studio doors this week, with the installation of deadbolts. If we look back at the doors in any of the previous episodes, we can see they weren't here before. Frasier proceeds to briefly take his show back over, where he is absolutely no help to any of his callers. His callers during this scene are Tommy Hilfiger, who is not an actor at all. This is his first of only 4 credited roles. The other 3 he will play himself. Hilfiger is a fashion designer. You've seen Hilfiger clothing before? That's his. He's a pretty interesting guy outside of his clothing brand, and also has some ties to the music world, including assisting in both Britney Spears and Lenny Kravitz tours. Next, we have Patricia Hearst, who, again, not an actress, but a fascinating historical figure. She was a kidnapping victim in 1974 at the age of 19 by the Symbionese Liberation Army, or the SLA. 2 months after her abduction, she joined the SLA and participated in a bank robbery. From there, she went on to make bombs for the SLA and was a fugitive for some time. At trial, she claimed this was done because she was brainwashed and abused during her kidnapping. She was later pardoned by President Clinton. We've had some interesting guest callers before, but I'm pretty sure this is the first one who's been involved in a bank robbery. Next is our first actual actress guest caller, with Mary Tyler Moore of The Mary Tyler Moore Show. We've talked about her a little before when they reused sets for the CB Awards, so I don't want to go too much into her here. But Moore is a star. She's done a ton of television, notably The Mary Tyler Moore Show and The Dick Van Dyke Show, and was a huge Hollywood influence during her life. Due to the sheer number of guest callers this week, I don't have time to give her her proper due. But like everyone else who called in this week, Moore is more than interesting enough to carry a documentary of her own. And that wraps our 7th guest caller this week. The High Frasier is escorted out of the studio by 2 creditless studio guards. Much like Gil's producer, I'm not sure who was playing the guards. If anyone knows who these actors are, please feel free to put it in the comments. Our coda is ridiculous this week, and I love it. Eddie looks great in Roz's seat and is perfect for it. I would normally have thought this ending was silly, but given the dream context from earlier in the episode, it works really well for the coda this week. One quick note on this scene, we can tell this was shot before the rest of the episode, because there aren't any deadbolts on the office doors yet. This episode doesn't just feature a gargantuan amount of guest callers. It also has a metric ton of ties, with a total of 7 ties appearing, 4 for Frasier and 3 for Niles. Out of Frasier's 4 ties, 3 of them are new. The first one last appeared in episode 7, while the others are all making their first appearance here. Niles also only has 1 repeat tie this week, with his second tie last showing up in episode 18. This means there are 3 new ties for Frasier this week, and 2 for Niles, tying the brothers up at 26 different ties each for the series, and a whopping total of 52 thus far. Martin still sits at 4, which gives us enough ties to make a deck of cards with 4 jokers. This feels like a mammoth episode of Frasier with all the guest stars, and yet I still can't help but feel there was one major thing missing this week. And that's an appearance by Bulldog Briscoe. Gil is fun, and he's a nice contrast from the other radio hosts we've met before, but he's not quite as entertaining as Bulldog, and with such a studio-centric episode, it would have been nice for him to make an appearance here. This complaint aside, this episode really brings it. We have some great guest callers, including a really funny opening scene with Steve Young, before moving into a slew of off-the-wall guest callers who all have huge places in history. The fact that Mary Tyler Moore is probably our least interesting guest caller this week speaks volumes to just how strong of a stable the producers were able to pull in here. We have a ton of great acting this week, first from David Hyde Pierce, who I personally think was a lot more entertaining here than in his favorite episode, Author. He's a delight to see going full televangelist, and to be honest, let's get better is probably a better tagline than I'm listening. Kelsey Grammer also brings it with his acting this week, granted, in a different way. I like it when Grammer acts like a child, as long as it's not overdone. And with the drugs, this is the perfect excuse for him to pull out the childish acting card. For the first time ever, we see the inside of Frasier's bedroom with a lot of interesting things, including an early iMac computer and framed Rorschach tests, and we even get a dream sequence that works well enough for what it is. I didn't love the ending bit where we had a fake out thinking Frasier's rudeness on the radio might also have been another dream, but it's a flaw I'm more than willing to overlook for how good the acting and guest callers this week were. If you're ready to see Frasier's radio days, give this 8.5 out of 10 episode of Frasier a watch.